Depending on who you ask, 2023 has been a pretty good year when it comes to revisiting classic games. So far, we've already had the remake of Dead Space, Metroid Prime Remastered, the remake of Resident Evil 4 that I surprisingly enjoyed. Nightdive Studios not only released a remaster of Rise of the Triad, but also a full-blown remake of the original System Shock. And there's a re-release of Red Dead Redemption coming very soon, which I feel like I'm the only one sort of excited to play that. Oh, and there's the Silent Hill 2 remake coming too, I guess.
Okay. Ah! Some good names here, and then... Ah!
Now, Nightdive Studios are back again with Quake 2 Remastered that just released at Quakecon, in a similar fashion to their remaster of Quake 1 back in 2021. And since I did a video way back covering Quake 1's remaster, I figured I should also take a look at Nightdive's latest effort with Quake 2. Part of what makes this particular remaster interesting for me is because there is a bit of history when it comes to Quake 2 and its various ports to different platforms over the years, and that this isn't technically the first time the game has been remastered, since back in 2019, Nvidia gave us Quake 2 RTX. But let's start at the beginning, shall we?
When will Doom ship? When it's done. When will Quake ship? When it's done.
Quake 2 was released back in December 1997, during something of a period of tension within id Software, as this was after co-founder John Romero was fired, and then spent 4 years on the disastrous Daikatana. The game was originally intended as a new IP, with a working title called War, as they wanted to create something with a bit more focus than Quake 1's mishmash of sci-fi and Lovecraftian horror, but eventually they just called it Quake 2. Once again, Quake 2 saw you playing as a lone space marine, because this trope never dies, this time stranded on the alien planet Astrogos, trying to prevent an invasion on Earth. The gameplay was very similar to id's previous games like Doom and Quake, with familiar weapons like double-barrel shotguns, BFGs and grenade launchers, along with similar enemies too, redesigned to fit more in line with the more sci-fi art direction. The animation was a big step up too, with much more fluid motion on enemies compared to the janky looking Quake 1 animations, and there were a number of different death animations for enemies, which gave the game a lot of character. I remember being impressed by this when I first played it, as I only had Crash Bandicoot 3 as a reference point for having lots of different death animations. The biggest change was the level progression, with Quake 2 using mission units comprised of a small number of interconnected levels that you would travel back and forth across, fighting monsters and completing objectives like finding keys or activating a series of switches. You know, very much like Doom. This change, combined with the art direction and level design, did make it feel like you were exploring through a somewhat realistic world and not just disparate levels. It was with the game's new technology, the id Tech 2 engine, where Quake 2 was the most evolutionary, as John Carmack created the engine with 3D hardware accelerated GPUs in mind, to pull off more advanced rendering like 3D coloured real-time lighting and filter texturing, among other things. With 3D hardware support available at launch, there were essentially two quite drastically different looking versions of Quake 2 you could play, depending on your hardware at the time. I first played Quake 2 on an old computer using the software renderer that I'm actually rather fond of, as I find the visuals it offers to be quite gritty looking with all the pixels, even though it definitely has its drawbacks, like shadowed areas can look a bit harsh in places and all the lighting work is reworked to a more grayscale look. The hardware or OpenGL version, however, takes full advantage of 3D coloured lighting that does give the game a much more vibrant look, that also better reflects the orange Mars-like skyboxes. The downside of the hardware version at the time came down to how good your computer and GPU was, as these visuals took a lot to produce, and to possibly get a good frame rate back then could require turning the texture quality down, which could result in the game looking like this, which isn't ideal. Either way, Quake 2 was and still is an impressive looking game for the time, and the engine would go on to produce even more stunning results with Raven Software's Soldier of Fortune, and the sadly forgotten about Heretic 2, that I would love to see remastered.
The heretic! You are Corvus!
I know who I am.
Later in July 1999, an interesting port of sorts for Quake 2 launched on the Nintendo 64, much like the first game was ported to the system in 1998. What was interesting about this version was that it wasn't actually a port of Quake 2, as the N64 couldn't handle that engine. but was instead a new game based on Quake 2, built in the Quake 1 engine, with mostly brand new levels, a couple being simplified renditions of Quake 2's first expansion pack, along with a new atmospheric soundtrack by Aubrey Hodges, who also scored Quake 64 and the PS1 ports of Doom. A few months later in October then saw the release of Quake 2 on the PlayStation, and this is another impressive technical achievement as the PlayStation version does try to replicate a lot of the PC version, and does a remarkable job considering the hardware. There are only 20 levels on PlayStation compared to 39 on PC, and when you do comparisons between the two, you can see there were a lot of concessions made with the complexity of the level's environments, and the maps were broken up into smaller segments with loading tunnels in order to pull this all off. Other changes were made to enemy placements, and there was a lot more health and ammo pickups, likely to compensate for the difficulty of the somewhat awkward PlayStation controls. But nonetheless, it remains an impressive version of Quake 2 and one of the more visually striking first-person shooters on PlayStation, falling just behind Alien Resurrection in my opinion.
Remember short controlled bursts.
The source code for Quake 2 would eventually be released in 2001, which would lead the way to modern source ports being made to run the game in later years, with KM Quake 2 being the one that I've used a fair bit over the last few years, since it offers some cool new features like increased gore effects when killing enemies, and adjustable water caustics, which I think just looks really neat in the Quake 2 engine. But mainly I like the source port because it plays the amazing soundtrack by Sonic Mayhem without hassle. One thing that can't be argued is that Quake 2 has one of the best soundtracks produced for a game, with a return to the heavier metal influenced sound of Doom mixed with electronic synths, and it's literally what Mick Gordon was trying to replicate with Doom 2016.
I felt that all I was trying to do with the Doom music was just write a modern version of the stuff that he was doing for Quake 2 back in the day.
And lastly, there was the incredible RTX remaster in 2019, updated with brand new textures and assets designed to fully take advantage of and showcase ray tracing graphics cards, and a smart move from Nvidia given how easy it is to run Quake 2, essentially making the whole thing a glorified tech demo. The remaster boasted stunning looking realistic lighting work that greatly enhances the atmosphere, and stunning uses of ray trace reflections across surfaces like large monitors seen throughout the game world, although they did go a tad overboard in places like the first boss battle. It's a fascinating way to revisit the game and one of the more impressive remaster efforts I've seen. And having played Quake 2 RTX made me really curious to see what Nightdive Studios were going to bring to the table with their remaster, although I obviously wasn't expecting results like Quake 2 RTX, but the results are definitely interesting. Very much like their work on the Quake 1 remaster, a lot of the changes made with this remaster are subtle at a glance and are all designed with keeping the original look of the game intact. Starting with all of the in-game models, the same approach as Quake 1 was taken in that all of the enemy and weapon models have been carefully remodeled with a much higher polygon count that adds a lot of little touches to make them look more polished, yet still being immediately recognizable to those familiar with the old game. And you can also toggle between the old and new models whenever you want from the menu. The lighting work throughout the game has also been redone and updated with more modern rendering techniques to produce more realistic lighting effects, as well as just overall being much brighter and clearer than the original. There are a few examples in the very first level that highlight these new lighting changes, like right here at the beginning near this broken column. There is a hole in the roof, and in the original, the lighting is kind of a loose approximation of lighting coming down from the roof. Whereas here in the remaster, the lighting not only looks much more natural, but also creates accurate shadow lines based on the geometry where the light is coming from. Another example can be seen in this drain area. As you can see, there's a large fan in the ceiling, which back in '97 was a cool geometric detail, whereas here in the remaster there's actually light and shadows being created here that really draws your attention to it. This was something you could also see in Quake 2 RTX. The remaster also makes great use of dynamic lighting that's now able to cast proper shadows from characters that look really nice, as you can not only see your own shadow now, but also enemies before they're even in your line of sight.
Welcome to the dungeon, Marine. Most unexciting place on Mars.
Unlike the Quake 1 remaster, where aside from E2-M6 the levels were left untouched, this time Nightdive has implemented a few subtle changes in places throughout some maps to add a bit more scene complexity. Like here in this bridge room in level 2, you can see that a new railing has been added to the other side of the bridge. Or here in this room where the Enforcer triggers these explosions. In the remaster, these explosions actually create little craters in the floor, which is just a neat touch. I have heard that there are cut areas from earlier builds of Quake 2 restored, but I'm not really familiar enough with Quake 2's campaign and the secret levels to confirm if this is true. But it wouldn't surprise me since you can actually play through a couple of early press demos that are found in the bonus menu. But while I'm on the topic of cut content, one of the more notable things Nightdive have done is that they've restored a number of enemy animations, like the parasites can get their tongues stuck on walls, and more specifically behaviours, like enemies are now able to jump down from ledges, whereas before they would just do this. One enemy in particular stands out with these restored features. The Berserkers in the original game were a fairly common enemy that sprinted towards you and would either soccer punch you, or they had an uppercut attack that could send you flying backwards. But they were mostly harmless, as more often than not they could be put down before they even reached you. That's not the case anymore, as Nightdive have restored an ability that enables the Berserkers to perform a super jump towards you that is always connected to a sonic attack on impact that sends you flying backwards. This single change has a pretty drastic impact on combat scenarios, as before they were just mild nuisances, now they are the #1 priority whenever you see them, as this new attack is really good at throwing you off center and even getting you cornered. I tell ya, seeing the Berserker jump over this trap I've used 100 times in the original to kill it was one of the biggest jump scares I've had in a while. These changes made quite a bit of an impact as I replayed through the original Quake 2 campaign, and I'm not sure if I just suck now, but overall I found the game a bit harder than I remember, which is kind of why it took me a while to play through nearly all of the content on offer in this remaster. And yeah, there is a lot of Quake 2 here.
Okay, grab your gear.
So obviously you get the original Quake 2 campaign, which is a lot longer than Quake 1, taking anywhere from 9 to 12 hours, whereas I can beat Quake 1 in around 5 hours. I think my main criticism with Quake 2 as a game is that it feels a lot longer than it is because a lot of the levels start to feel quite samey after a while, as you're just moving from one industrial sci-fi base to the next. That and the last few levels are a little bit bullshit with their difficulty, and over-reliance on the spongy tank commander enemies. Also included are the 2 official expansion packs that were released from Zaytrax and Rogue Entertainment, with The Reckoning and Ground Zero, both of which I hadn't played much of and never finished. So I did for this video, and what I was not expecting was how long these expansions are. The 2 expansions for Quake 1 were about 3 hours each, whereas these 2 expansions are upwards of 6 to 7 hours each, almost like entirely new games. There are some really cool levels spread throughout these expansions, with a much greater variety than the original campaign, with a lot more outdoor environments you get to see, which I always get a kick out of seeing how developers tried to pull off outdoor areas on old 3D engines.
Yeah, this is what I do all day.
There are also new enemies and weapons added too, like an ETF rifle, a plasma beam, and a particle cannon, and a mostly useless chainsaw. Most of the new enemies are featured in The Reckoning, which overall I think makes it the more challenging expansion out of the 2. The Nintendo 64 version of Quake 2 is also ported into this remaster, which is a pretty neat addition to play through from a historic and games preservation perspective, even though it isn't quite as impressive or interesting to play through after the original and its expansions. I'm a little bit disappointed that the PlayStation port wasn't also included, as I think that's just as fascinating as the N64 version, with the numerous level alterations that would have been cool to see in playthrough, although maybe it'll get added later, similar to how additional level packs have been added to the Quake 1 remaster.
Enough excuses. Just do your job and get the science team what they need.
And finally, just like Quake 1 Remastered, there is a brand new campaign added, Call of the Machine, developed by Machine Games, and this is a collection of levels that have been designed to really push the Quake 2 engine well beyond what was possible in 1997. It follows the same kind of setup as Dimension of the Machine from Quake 1, where you essentially pick levels in any order from a warp room of sorts. The levels boast areas with massive vistas to look out at, along with an incredible level of fidelity when it comes to geometric complexity. The results are at times a little bit reminiscent of last year's Proteus, which I said in my review reminded me a lot of Quake 2. It's always fascinating to see developers taking old engines like this to produce brand new content and show off how far we've come in terms of technology and level design. Overall, Call of the Machine is a really fun expansion, not just from a technical standpoint, but it's also pretty well balanced for the most part. There was one level I found to be a tad bullshit, but most of the other levels were great to play through, and I enjoyed how there was more encouragement to use quad damage in a number of large-scale combat encounters, and lots of opportunities to just go a little bit nuts. As far as remasters go, especially at a time where it seems like we're getting lots of re-releases and remakes of older games, this remaster of Quake 2 I think is a great example of how to do a remaster, and is another fine addition to Nightdive Studios' track record. You get quite a substantial amount of content with this remaster, all for the same price as the Quake 1 remaster, along with it being a completely free upgrade if you already owned the game on Steam. It may not exactly be as incredible of a technical achievement as the Quake 2 RTX remaster, but since the goal was to honour that original PC experience, I think Nightdive have done a fantastic job. I think the only caveat attached to this remaster is that if you were never really a fan of Quake 2 to begin with, as there are some people who really don't like this game, I'm not entirely sure if the efforts made in this remaster will be enough to sway you into liking the game now. But hey, there are also people who hate Quake 4, so you can't please everyone. With that all said, this has been my look at Quake 2 Remastered. Let me know your thoughts and memories of Quake 2 in the comments. Don't forget to like and subscribe, and I also have a Patreon if you want to support me. Until next time, stay safe out there everyone, and I'll see you all in the next video.